The Starfleet life with the USS Dauntless. Are you brave enough to be a Starfleet officer? Do you have what it takes? Greetings. I'm Admiral Swart, Commanding Officer, USS Dauntless, and this is the briefing with the Admiral for stardate -25-0002.1. I am the Admiral in question, and today we're going to be talking about daily devotionals. But before we get on to today's topic, we have our usual catch up that we need to do, which is to alert everybody to the fact that these briefings are typically recorded at 12:30 p.m. on a Tuesday, South African Standard Time, here in the Dauntless Discord server in the screening room channel. So if you are an active duty member of the crew, you're welcome to join us here if you're available at that time, which is admittedly an awkward time. It's not mandatory or compulsory or anything like that. It's what we call a priority 3 mission. So if you're available, please join us. If you're not, that's not a problem. You can catch the video later on either YouTube or Facebook. We do attempt to stream this video also live to YouTube, but it doesn't always work that way. It's from my board, it looks like it's not happening right now. We'll find out afterwards. If it doesn't, then I'll upload it later. So you'll be able to catch the video later on YouTube, and that will be fine. Facebook as well. If you are an active duty member of the crew and you are watching us live, you're welcome to participate in the chat here in the screening room channel. There's a lively conversation going throughout most of the session, but if you have something that you'd like me to see, if there's a question or a comment that you'd like me to address at the end, please make sure that you @tag me in the chat so that I can, when I'm scrolling back up through the chat, I can find your message and I can action it appropriately, because there's a lot of conversation and I can't go back through all of it. So that will be fine. Next, I want to talk about why we're here and who we are and what all of this means for those who are uninitiated. So we are the USS Dauntless, which is a future-focused advocacy and action group, which is at its core a Star Trek fan club based in Cape Town, South Africa. We are a chapter of Starfleet, the International Star Trek Fan Association Incorporated, which is the single largest Star Trek fan organization in the world. And it is a Starfleet style organization, which means that we pattern our organizational structure and a lot of our sort of superficial and cosmetic and thematic elements on the fictional Starfleet as depicted in Star Trek, which is why we have ranks, titles, uniforms, etc., and why our chapters are local groups of members. Chapters are referred to as starships. So that is a metaphor. It's not a real starship. We don't think we're actually flying through space. It is a conceptual starship, which is the whole of imaginary tritanium that binds us together. The crew is not a ship. The ship is not a ship. The ship is the crew. What is Star Trek? Star Trek is a fictional franchise, television series and films created by Gene Roddenberry. This man here started back in the 1960s and is ongoing today, and it depicts an optimistic future of humankind, and that is where Starfleet International in general and the USS Dauntless in particular are most interested. We are interested in that optimistic future where it depicts a world in which most of the problems that we face today, things like poverty, disease, crime, war, etc., have been largely, if not entirely, eliminated, at least on Earth, if not elsewhere in the galaxy as well. And we strive to undertake whatever we can do to help shift our present day society in the direction of that optimistic future by taking direct action and also through advocacy. And part of our advocacy is in promoting Star Trek itself, because this is the thing that has inspired us and brought us together. And it's our hope that by promoting it, we can inspire others to join our mission, if not join our actual organization as well. So our mission, which is to bring the message of Gene Roddenberry's vision for the future of humankind to the people of Africa and the Middle East, is clarified in a number of standing orders. And the first one of those, which is arguably, well, it's one of the two most important ones, standing order number 1, which is to promote Star Trek to our friends, families, and the people around us. And that is further clarified to say that we promote and represent Star Trek online and in person. But what is not articulated explicitly here, but I think is implied, is that we have a mandate to study Star Trek ourselves. Although, of course, we like Star Trek, which is why we're here. We enjoy watching it. And there is, just the casual enjoyment aspect of it. I think it behooves us to develop an understanding of the Star Trek canon that is as deep as we possibly can, because we represent the Star Trek brand. Although we're not employed by or affiliated with Paramount Studios in any way. Paramount, of course, is the organization that currently owns the rights to the Star Trek franchise. We are a fan-run, fan-organized, and fan-funded group, completely independent from Paramount. We think that Star Trek contains a very important message, and we have taken it upon ourselves to promote that message. And in doing so, we are the de facto and unofficial representatives of the Star Trek brand. So it behooves us to understand that brand as well as we possibly can. And that, as I said, involves studying it. And that's what the daily devotionals are all about. So it's about living up to the Dauntless and Starfleet values by studying the Star Trek canon, both as entertainment and as a roadmap for the future. So the more we can understand the Star Trek on its own terms from an internal point of view, the better we can be at doing our jobs as Starfleet officers. So the daily devotionals is a bit of a tongue-in-cheek name. So daily devotional, I got the name from a practice that is used by a lot of religious folks that I know, in which they will read through their religious canon, typically the Bible. This is something I've heard Christians talk about. I haven't really heard it spoken about by other religious practitioners, but I'm sure there are some. Specifically Christians that I know do this, where they will read through their religious canon, the Bible, and they will read a passage every single day, daily devotional. And they will read into that passage and sort of try to think of ways that it might apply to their daily life. Now, we are not a religion. We're not Christians. We don't worship Star Trek or even Gene Roddenberry or anything like that. But we do have a somewhat religious devotion to our franchise of choice, which is Star Trek. So I think that it's fitting that we borrow the name daily devotional for our practice, which is somewhat similar. I want to also make clear up front that the daily devotional program is not an officially sanctioned Dauntless program. This is a personal project that I do for myself, and I share it with my partner, Commander Patterson. And some time back, I decided that since I was doing all this work anyway, and it was something that might be of interest to fellow Star Trek fans, I decided to share my daily devotional project with the rest of the Dauntless crew. But it is my personal project that I share. So when I'm talking about this today, I'm just relaying my own activities as a member of the Dauntless. And we'll cover it on that basis. So I see daily devotionals as a tool for studying and sharing Star Trek because it's vital to the existence of the Dauntless. So again, appreciation of and studying of Star Trek is sort of the lifeblood of what we are. And we can't get by simply watching each new Star Trek as it comes in. We happen to be living in a time now where we're getting a fair amount of new Star Trek coming in. We're getting dozens of new episodes a year. That hasn't always been the case. 20 years ago, when the Dauntless was founded, there was no new Star Trek in production or on the horizon. And we had years go by without any new Star Trek additions to the canon. So we're fortunate now, but that hasn't always been the case and may not always be the case. So we need to be engaging with the Star Trek universe as actively as possible as we proceed. So it's important to the lifeblood, the momentum and the what's the word, the esprit de corps of the USS Dauntless, that we continue to actively engage with the Star Trek canon. Oh, canon is another word that probably is worthy of explaining. So a canon refers to a body of work that can be considered comprehensive and complete. So in religious circles, the Bible, various books of the Bible, both the Old and New Testament, are considered by Christians to be canon. Now, of course, there is disagreement between different groups of Christians, different versions, or what's the word? I've forgotten the word. There's a word that they hate. Denominations. That's the word. Different denominations of the Christian church don't necessarily agree on which books should be included in the Bible and which should not. So there is somewhat variable canon. We also have things like the literary canon, the Anglophone canon. So that consists of all of the works of literature that we consider we as a society, as a group of scholars, consider to be the definitive body of work that relates to our ethno-linguistic context. So the Anglophone canon is a series of works which includes the Bible, by the way. It includes things like Charles Dickens, William Shakespeare, all the way back to Virgil and Homer and people like that. All of those works are considered part of that canon. When we're talking about the Star Trek canon, we're talking about a very specific set of published materials that is, although it's changing all the time, the rules around which new material can be admitted into the canon are quite strict most of the time, although those rules have also changed over history. So in terms of what the canon is, what those rules are, is that it includes material only created by the current franchise holder for Star Trek. So at the moment, that's Paramount CBS. Over the life of the Star Trek franchise, that has been various different franchise holders, whether it was CBS, whether it was Paramount Pictures or Desilu Studios. But whoever the current owner of the Star Trek franchise is, they produce material. Only they can produce canon material. Secondly, it has to be material that is either live action, so actually filmed with real actors, or animated. So those two things, live action or animated. And it also has to be something that is explicitly declared by the license holder or the franchise holder to be part of the canon. So let me cite an example here. Something like the Very Short Treks was a series of animated shorts that was published by Paramount CBS a couple of years ago as part of an online event, but they were explicitly marked as being non-canon. So we don't include those in the canon. We can watch those for fun if we like, but we don't consider them to be part of the canon. Also things like novels or comic books or video games, things like that, which might be fun and might be interesting, they are not canon. Sometimes individual elements, so characters or plot elements or story devices that are introduced in non-canon sources are later included into canon, but until we see those things in canon, they don't exist. We can only look to those as possible explanations for questions that we might have when we're studying the canon. So what does that include? Let me make sure I'm not getting ahead of myself. Okay, so let's do the list of what that includes. So here I've got a spreadsheet here of the entire Star Trek canon in viewing order. You know what, we're getting ahead of ourselves. Right, so what's included in canon? So we've got Star Trek, the original series, which came out back in 1960s, which was originally just called Star Trek. There is a series of feature films based on the characters introduced in the original series. We've got Star Trek: The Next Generation, another television series, 7 seasons of that. Star Trek: Deep Space Nine, an offshoot. Star Trek: Voyager, which is another spin-off. 4 feature films based on the cast of Star Trek: The Next Generation. Then we've got prequel series Star Trek Enterprise, Star Trek Discovery, Star Trek Strange New Worlds, Star Trek Lower Decks, Star Trek Picard, Star Trek Prodigy, and then a series of shorts called Star Trek Short Treks, not to be mistaken for Star Trek Very Short Treks. There is also a new standalone feature film, Star Trek Section 31, which came out just weeks ago. We'll go into how all of these things fit together, but that is and I've forgotten the animated series. Star Trek, the animated series, which was an animated cartoon, came out in the 70s, which was intended as a 4th season of Star Trek, the original series. So that is a comprehensive list of everything that is included in canon at the moment. So that, no, it's not. I've still forgotten something. There were 3 new feature films starting in 2009, and then 2 following films, Star Trek Into Darkness and Star Trek Beyond, which is sort of a trilogy, also a spin-off trilogy. So that is the Star Trek canon as it stands today. Now, which order should we watch those in? We're talking about nearly 900 episodes or feature films, many hundreds of hours of footage. What is the correct order to watch them in? Well, I contend that there is no correct order. A lot of people like to watch them in production order, so starting with the original series and then moving to Next Generation and so on. What that means then is that after you've finished watching Star Trek Voyager, you then travel back in time about 150 years to watch Enterprise, which was a prequel series, and then you start jumping back and forth quite a lot when you get to the more recent content because those are all over the place. I think that There's also another order, which is release order, which is very similar to production order. It really only affects the sequence in which you watch things when you're talking about the original series. Because back in the 1960s, TV series were designed to be episodic. Each episode is sort of a self-contained narrative. There were very few, if any, narrative arcs that would stretch from one episode to another, so you could actually watch them in any sequence at all. So although they were made in a particular sequence, they were not necessarily screened in that order. And so, for example, the very first episode that was screened on television was one called The Man Trap, which was actually the sixth or seventh episode that was produced. And the very first episode that was produced wasn't even screened until the 1980s. So things got all out of whack when it comes to release order. Even production order isn't the most reliable sequence. I contend that the best way to watch these in a context that makes the most difference when you're studying the nature of canon is in chronological sequence from an in-universe point of view. So I've just discussed this in a previous briefing, but I'll bring it up again here. We have two different points of view when we're discussing any fictional canon of works. Sherlock Holmes scholars developed a term called the Watsonian point of view versus the Doylean point of view. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was the author who created the original Sherlock Holmes mysteries. So the Doylean point of view is from outside, from the real world, looking into the fictional universe. Then the Watsonian point of view is from the point of view of John Watson, who is Sherlock Holmes's sidekick, who is the fictional author within the context of those novels. Ostensibly, he wrote them, those novels, as publications of his personal notebooks. So from his point of view, looking out from within the fictional universe, you've got the Watsonian point of view from inside, or the Doylean point of view from the outside. I contend that the correct or optimal way of enjoying the Star Trek canon in sequence is through the Watsonian chronological sequence. And this image that I've got up on the screen now gives us a sense of how those things fit together in very broad strokes. And it gets a lot more complicated than this, and we'll get into some of the complications. For now, we're only going to look at this yellow line. So we start right at the beginning with Star Trek Enterprise, which is set in the mid-22nd century. We then jump ahead about a century to the first two seasons of Star Trek Discovery, which then spins off to Star Trek Strange New Worlds. Then a few years later, we've got Star Trek, the original series, simply called Star Trek originally. Then the animated series follows on from the original series directly. Then we have the first 6 feature films: the motion picture Wrath of Khan, Search for Spock, The Voyage Home, The Final Frontier, and The Undiscovered Country. There's then a gap. That's the gap that has actually recently been filled. So this diagram is a little bit out of date now, because roughly in the middle of this line here, we have the new film Star Trek Section 31, which is set about 40 years after The Undiscovered Country and about 30 years before Star Trek The Next Generation starts. Next Generation lasts for 7 seasons. Each season lasts roughly a year in universe, but overlapping with the Next Generation from season 6 onwards is Deep Space Nine. So season 6 of Next Generation and season 1 of Deep Space Nine happen at the same time. We're looking at 2 different parts of the universe, of the galaxy, happening at more or less the same time. There's very little direct communication between them, but they are occurring simultaneously. TNG continues for another 3 seasons, well, another 2 seasons. Then once that ends, Voyager begins, which now also overlaps season for season with Deep Space Nine. We've got 3 more films, this time featuring the cast of the Next Generation. We've got Generations, First Contact, and Insurrection. Generations is a complicated one, and we'll get into why that's complicated a little later. Then we get to the end of Deep Space Nine. At the end of DS9 Season 7, Voyager continues for a couple more seasons after that, and then it ends. Following that, about a year later, we get Star Trek Nemesis, which is another feature film featuring the Next Generation cast. A year or so later, we get the animated series Star Trek Lower Decks, which continues for, although it's 5 seasons from a Doylean point of view, from a Watsonian point of view, it all happens within a period of about a year and a half. Then another year or so after that, we have Star Trek Prodigy, which continues for 2 seasons from a Doylean point of view, but again, from a Watsonian point of view, it takes about the same amount of time, about a year and a half. Then there's a jump of 16 years, which takes us up to 2399, now the late 24th century, and now we have Star Trek Picard, which continues for 3 seasons and spans 3 years. Yeah, more or less. Then we have the biggest gap in the whole Star Trek canon. We have a gap of about 750 years, give or take, between the end of Star Trek Picard and Star Trek Discovery Season 3. So Star Trek Discovery Season 3 has that big break in it because in the narrative, what happens at the end of season 2 is the ship and crew of the USS Discovery travel forward in time. That's what this dotted line here means. They jump 900 years into the future, and that continues from there for 3 seasons. That is, in broad strokes, the prime timeline of Star Trek. Now, the Kelvin timeline, which is the 3 most recent feature films, Star Trek, that came out in 2009, Star Trek Into Darkness, and Star Trek Beyond, they are based from a time travel story. So this is what makes the Star Trek canon chronology so difficult, is that we've got so much time travel. But at this point here, there is a major incident called the Romulan supernova. At that time, some characters travel back in time. That's this dotted line here. Some of them travel all the way back to here at 2233, and they alter the timeline. Now this creates this new blue timeline, which we call the Kelvin timeline. Why is it called the Kelvin timeline? Because the incident that happens here, the temporal incursion, is called sometimes called the Kelvin incident and sometimes called the Narita incident. But why is it called? Does it have 2 names? Because there are 2 ships involved, the USS Kelvin and the Narita, and you can decide which one you want to name it after. But we generally, in this parlance, we refer to it as the Kelvin timeline, which then proceeds along here. And then we have in 2258, in this Kelvin timeline, we have the first film, followed by a couple of years later, the second, and then the third. And that is the entire Kelvin timeline as we have it for now. We know that the Kelvin timeline continues because we're aware of there being some crossover later in time. This red line down here is yet another timeline called the mirror universe. Now, there's no Star Trek that's set primarily or principally in the mirror universe. This is just another universe that exists parallel to the prime universe, with which characters that we recognize make contact from time to time. And on at least one occasion, a character permanently migrates from the mirror universe across to the prime universe. That doesn't happen very often, but it's there. All right, so this is, in broad strokes, the Star Trek chronology. Excuse me, let me take a sip. Apologies. All right, it gets a lot more complicated than this. So before I get into the complications, I want to talk about how we structure the daily devotionals. So as the name suggests, it's a daily practice. So I have created a spreadsheet, which looks like this, which contains every single Star Trek episode or film in chronological order with a viewing date assigned to it. And that is algorithmically generated, and I will update it from time to time as needed. And on that date, this is the episode that I will watch. And I recommend that you watch with me so that we can discuss it. So that's the basic format. It's as simple as that. We watch an episode a day according to that schedule. And then I suggest that, or recommend or encourage people to discuss the day's episode with me in the Future History channel here on the Dauntless Discord. Again, Future History is a somewhat obscure name. It's, again, a bit of a tongue-in-cheek name inspired by the film Galaxy Quest, which is a sort of a Star Trek spoof, came out 20 plus years ago now, in which they have a joke that an alien race has detected the transmissions of a Star Trek-like show called Galaxy Quest, and they interpreted it as being real historical events. They refer to it as historical documents. So when we're studying Star Trek, we're studying future history. That's my joke anyway, but we're actually just studying Star Trek, and that's the channel where this happens. I've set up an automated bot so that every single day it will post the name of the episode that we're supposed to be watching together that day in the Future History channel, and we can use that post, comment off it, or create a thread off it, and we can discuss whatever happened in that episode if we like. It also includes a link to the Memory Alpha page for that episode, so we can get some background information on that. I use it as a commentary or a study guide. Memory Alpha, for those who are not familiar, is kind of the Wikipedia of Star Trek. It's a very comprehensive, community-driven resource, and it contains everything you could possibly want to know about Star Trek. Click through to Memory Alpha and you can find out whatever you need to know. It's got episode summaries, behind the scenes information. It links concepts to each other so that you can follow up on any strange word or term or idea that you hear about in an episode and you want to learn more about it. Memory Alpha is the place where you go to do that. This episode is not sponsored by Memory Alpha, just like it's not sponsored by Paramount. I just think it's a really great resource. A lot of information is available on StarTrek.com, but it's really not comprehensive. Memory Alpha is probably the optimal place to go. What distinguishes Memory Alpha from similarly named sources, Memory Beta and Memory Gamma, is that Memory Beta includes non-canon sources, so things like comic books and novels and games are included in Memory Beta, and Memory Gamma includes published fan fiction, so people who have written their own Star Trek adventures and it's become popular online. I'm not really sure what the threshold is for deciding what should be included in Gamma or not, but suffice to say, if you're looking for canon, your source should be Memory Alpha. Right, so continuing. That is how. So that's the structure of the daily devotionals. We watch an episode together. Well, we watch an episode each on our own in our own time, and then we discuss it together in the Future History channel. So let's talk about how we decide how the chronological sequence works, because although this timeline is fairly reliable, there are more exceptions than you might think, because time travel is the thing. So one of the things we look at first is figuring out what the in-universe dating actually is for any given episode. And sometimes that's pretty straightforward. Sometimes they'll straight up tell us. Okay, word about calendars. All right, so I've done an episode about calendars some months ago, but it's worth covering this again now. In Star Trek, there are basically 4 different calendars that are in use. There is the Gregorian calendar, which is the same calendar we use today. And then there is what they call the Stardate calendar, but that's actually 3 different calendars, and they work differently. The first one is the one that's used in the Kelvin timeline, which is basically just an alternate notation for the Kelvin, for the Gregorian calendar. So the Kelvin star dates are Gregorian dates. They're just expressed differently. So it's usually expressed as 4 digits, a decimal, and 2 digits. The 4 digits are the year in the Gregorian calendar. So and then the 2 digits after that are the month. Simple as that. They generally don't express star dates more accurately or more precisely than that, at least not on screen. So 2257.3 would be March 2257. Simple as that. The other 2 are a lot less simple than that. So in the original series period, so that's the mid 23rd century, they use one of a different Stardate calendar. This Stardate calendar works in a much more complicated way. They deliberately made it obscure. And when I say they, I mean the production staff. We're now talking from a Doylean point of view. The producers deliberately made it obscure because they wanted to, although they wanted to include a date format in the introduction to each episode of Star Trek, the original series, they wanted to make sure that there was no need to watch the episodes in sequence, again, because they couldn't guarantee that they would be screened in the sequence that they were produced in. So the star dates given at the beginning of those episodes are almost random. Not entirely random. You'll notice that they're kind of similar. This one is 1512.2, this one's 1429.1, 1672.1, but you'll notice that they are not sequential. So the description that we get is that the date is intended to anchor the Starship Enterprise to Earth. So stardates progress at a regular pace on Earth, but depending on where the Enterprise is in space, particularly how fast she's moving relative to Earth, that will affect how the date is displayed. So there is a live calculation happening within the ship's chronometer to determine what the relative date is between the Enterprise and Earth, and it is expressed in that 4-digit code. Which is obscure from our point of view, but to them it makes a lot of sense, apparently. So what that means, though, is that you can potentially be flying in a starship and arrive at your destination before you left. So it's not strictly speaking time travel, it's just a factor of how you're calculating your relative velocities and how that relates to the position of Earth from wherever you are in the galaxy. So the original series star dates are not sequential. They're not quite random, but they're definitely not sequential. and that extends to the other Star Trek shows that are set in that period: Star Trek Discovery, the first 2 seasons, and Star Trek Strange New Worlds. By the Next Generation series, they have changed the Stardate system so that it's a lot more regular. So again, from a Doylean point of view, in the 1980s, which is when the Next Generation came out, they were much more able to predict the sequence in which the episodes would be screened. The production company could dictate that to the networks, and the networks would most of the time follow those instructions. So the episodes could be made in a specific way, even though especially the early Next Gen episodes were still episodic and they were largely self-contained. There were narrative elements that happened in some episodes that needed to be carried over to future episodes. So there needed to be a reliable sequence, and so there was. So the stardates expressed in those episodes are almost entirely sequential. There are a couple of anomalies here or there, but that's probably can be chalked up to error rather than anything else. But you'll also notice that as we scroll down and we get through canon, we get to especially Star Trek Deep Space Nine. Deep Space Nine is the worst culprit of this, but it also applies in some of the later series, Star Trek Lower Decks, and especially Prodigy, where more than half of the episodes simply don't have an express date included. We don't know the exact star date of when they're supposed to be set. How do we determine when those happen? Well, there we have to start looking at secondary information. So if we know that this episode happened on this star date, and we know that the next episode continues the narrative from this episode, we can, by looking at in-universe clues and cues, we can come up with an educated guess of how much time has passed between those two episodes. It might be later the same day. It might be some days or weeks or months later. So we can guess where they are in the sequence. But really, in these kinds of gaps, we're mostly looking at the production sequence. So if this episode came out before that episode, and we know that the narrative episodes proceed one to the next, we can kind of infer where those fit in the sequence. That only is a factor in our viewing order when it comes to the period where Deep Space Nine is overlapping with Next Generation and Voyager. So it's probably fine as a practice to, when you're watching through those episodes in chronological order, to watch an episode of Next Generation and then watch an episode of DS9, Next Gen DS9, Next Gen DS9, and so on. Although strictly speaking, they don't necessarily line up chronologically in that way, it's probably close enough. There's very little direct communication between those crews, and when there is direct communication, it tends not to impact the knowledge of events from one crew to the other. There are only a couple of moments where there is actual crossover between them, where one crew exhibits knowledge of what the other crew is doing. And that only happens later. And frankly, if you're not paying precise attention, you wouldn't even notice that had happened. So the sequencing, when it comes to that, the in-universe date is usually close enough, except when it comes to the original series and the other 23rd century content. So how do we decide which sequence to watch the original series in if the star date is not reliable? I contend, and I'm open to being disagreed with on this point, that the production sequence probably should take precedence when we're talking about chronological viewing of the original series. Why do I say that? Because the episodes were made in a particular order, and the humans that made those episodes were carrying the knowledge that they had about the previous episodes forward into the new ones being created. So even though they were designed to be isolated and sort of each episode stands on its own merit, the writers and producers and directors and actors can't help but have memories in their heads from the previous episode that they made 2 weeks ago. So even inadvertently, they might let slip pieces of information that the character shouldn't have if they hadn't witnessed the episode that happened before. So watching them in original screening order, starting with the Man Trap, which is down here, episode 5, bearing in mind that the writers and director and actors performing in that episode have in their minds memories of having performed these previous 4 episodes. So even inadvertently, even accidentally, they might be carrying through some of those narrative elements into that episode in their performance or in their writing with a throwaway comment here or there. So I argue that production sequence is probably the optimal sequence in which to watch the original series, but that it probably doesn't really matter all that much. If you're going to stick to precise production sequence, go ahead. But whatever order Netflix serves it to you in is probably close enough. It likely doesn't make all that much difference. If I stand to be corrected on this, but I think that Netflix does actually follow a more or less production sequence in their presentation of it. So starting with Where No Man Has Gone Before, which was the actual pilot episode, as opposed to starting with The Man Trap. Why does that sequence matter? Well, because in the pilot episode, they hadn't yet locked in a lot of the stylistic elements of the show. For example, the uniforms are slightly different. The cast isn't all locked in. Some of the characters hadn't arrived yet that were going to be very important late in the series. So from a narrative point of view, it very clearly comes sometime before the Corbomite maneuver. But the Corbomite maneuver is definitely continuous with Mud's Woman, Enemy Within, The Man Trap, and so on. So I think that sequencing matters, but beyond that, probably not all that important. That said, there are sometimes problems and questions that are not easily resolved. So we have, for example, ambiguous or conflicting dates. So there is an episode sequence in Voyager. Let me try and find it here. It doesn't really matter. Okay, so there are two episodes, Life Signs and Investigations. So in the screening order and in the in-universe dating sequence, Life Signs comes first and then Investigations comes afterwards. However, in the episode Investigations, Tom Paris expresses memories of events that happened in Life Signs, indicating that they should be properly viewed the other way around. So in my sequence, I have switched them accordingly. As you can see, there are hundreds here. I'm not going to hunt them down, but there are other examples of that. Okay, I've already talked about the star dates. Oh, okay. It's worth mentioning here. Short tracks. So Star Trek Short Treks, as I mentioned, is a series of short episodes that fit in throughout the whole of Star Trek, clustered primarily in the mid-23rd century. So Short Treks, there were 2 seasons of it. I think there's maybe a dozen or so episodes in total. And these are episodes that are sort of 10 or 15 minutes long each. Some of them are storylines that properly belong within another episode, but they were just too long to include in that episode. So they've been sort of packaged as a separate one. This is one example of that, Runaway, in which we have Ensign Tilly meeting the Zahian princess. That's quite an important aspect for the storyline later in the series, but they just couldn't fit this into any of the episodes. So they released it as a standalone episode with only 2 characters in it, which is pretty cool. We also have the episode here, The Brightest Star, where we have Captain Georgiou meeting Saru for the first time, demonstrating that first contact. As a flashback, a 15-minute flashback would have been too long contained in any other episode, so it just made more sense as a self-contained short. Some of them were created as sort of ancillary episodes. So Q&A and Ask Not are both episodes about the Enterprise crew and how they got together, how they met, and establishing their characters before they are introduced into Star Trek Discovery. And then later they go on to Star Trek Strange New Worlds. Those were deliberately created to kind of expand on those characters a little bit and to introduce them. Another great example of that is down here. Where are we? Here. Children of Mars, which was sort of an introductory episode to the series Star Trek Picard. It's set here in 2385, and events that happen that are depicted in that Short Treks episode are very relevant, especially in the first season of Picard, but they carry on throughout the Picard series, even though it's 15 years before. That was sort of almost a prequel to that series. And then there are a couple that are completely standalone, that are not part of the main continuity at all, like Calypso, which is right here at the end, and we'll go into more detail about that later. We've got The Girl Who Made the Stars, which is an animated short, basically just an animation of Michael Burnham's human parents telling her a bedtime story when she's a child. That's fun, but it's not really part of the narrative or the greater story. And also the trouble with Edward is sort of part of the Tribbles backstory, but it's not part of the greater narrative. It's just a little bit of extra fun that was thrown in there. The one that is difficult is the mud problem. So there is an episode called The Escape Artist, in which we encounter Harry Mudd, Harry Mudd is a character originally introduced in the original series a couple of times. He featured also in the animated series, and he came back for an episode of Star Trek Discovery. Excuse me. Now, they decided to make a shorts episode of sort of surrounding Harry Mudd, which was very cool, and it shows him being pursued by a bounty hunter and then handed over to Starfleet. And at the end of the episode, we learn that Starfleet has been hunting down dozens of android replicas of Harry Mudd. Problem is that when we see Starfleet in this episode, they are clearly dressed in uniforms. I'm not seeing any stills of it here. They're not. They're clearly wearing uniforms from the Discovery era, so that's the Discovery Blues. But the android replicas can only really be can only have come into existence based on the original series episode I Mudd, which happens several years later, almost a decade later. So in I Mudd, that is when those android replicas are created and sent out into the galaxy. And in the Escape Artist, there we see Starfleet gathering up all those android replicas and bringing them back again. Because by the time we see Mudd again in the animated series, all those android replicas have been rounded up, and the Enterprise is tasked with taking down the one remaining true Harry Mudd. So from a narrative point of view, it can only fit in this spot, which is between Star Trek, the original series, and Star Trek, the animated series. It cannot fit during the Discovery era, even though stylistic elements put it there. The way we can resolve this is we look to Star Trek precedent. Elsewhere in Star Trek canon, are there any instances of members of Starfleet who are wearing what appears to be the wrong uniform for their time period? Fortunately, yes, there is. So if we look at the last few episodes of Star Trek Lower Decks, which is much, much later here in the continuity, sort of from Starbase, or especially Starbase 80. Starbase 80 is an installation in Starfleet, which is sort of the armpit of Starfleet. It's the worst possible place to be stationed in the whole of Starfleet. It is so poorly served by resources, it doesn't even have functional replicators. And so the crew are forced to scrounge up uniforms from whatever they can find, Starfleet surplus uniforms. In fact, the command crew of Starbase 80 are so hard up that they have to wear uniforms dating back over 200 years that would have been appropriate during the Star Trek Enterprise period, pre-Federation Starfleet uniforms. So even though they are serving here in the 2380s, they are wearing 2150s era uniforms, over 2 centuries old. So it's not unprecedented that Starfleet personnel will from time to time have to wear uniforms that are not appropriate for their time period. So based on the uniforms alone, we are not required, not required to move the Escape Artist earlier. And from a narrative point of view, we can quite comfortably slot it in between the original series and the animated series in that place. All right, so that's one problem. What other problems are there? So we've got episodes that involve time travel, and we also have episodes that span large periods of time. So one example of this is Star Trek Generations, which is it's the 7th feature film and the first feature film featuring the original, it's the Next Generation cast. Where is it here? There it is. So how do we slot this in? The way it works is that in the first 20 minutes or so of the film, it is set in the 23rd century in 2290s. And then there is a time skip of 70-something years, and then the narrative continues from there, here in the 24th century. So how do we decide which part of the timeline to include it in? The rule that I have decided upon, and this is my rule, and you don't have to follow this rule, but in terms of putting together the sequence, this is the rule that I've decided makes the most sense. If whatever time period an episode finishes in, that is the time in which we should consider that episode to be set. So, although it spans a period of about 70 years, and we could slot it in the 2290s, if we watch the entire movie in the 2290s time period, it's not really going to make any sense. So we slot it in the episode, we slot it into the sequence where the final scene of that movie takes place, which is here in the year 2371. So that one's relatively easily resolved. What about the original series Assignment Earth? So this is another tricky one. So in Star Trek: The Original Series, Season 2, which takes place in 2268. The final episode of the season is it's called Assignment Earth, and it's a time travel episode in which the crew travels back to the year 1968 and shenanigans ensue. Problem is, from the very first scene to the very final scene of the entire episode, all of it is set in 1968. The episode ends with the Enterprise flying off in space, ostensibly to return to their own time, but we never actually see them return to that time. We see the episode end, credits roll, it's still 1968. So because of that, according to the rule, we have to shift that episode all the way to the beginning as the very first episode of Star Trek, chronologically speaking. So even though there are, from a Watsonian point of view, there are hundreds of episodes that take place before this one, we simply can't shift it anywhere else if we're going to use in-universe dating as the primary principal sequencing metric. And so we do. So it happens in 1968, and therefore Assignment Earth is the very first episode of Star Trek, chronologically speaking. But I hear you say, what about Carpenter Street? So Star Trek Enterprise Season 3, there's an episode called Carpenter Street, in which a similar thing happens. The very first and very last scenes in the episode take place in the year 2004. So Archer and T'Pol travel back in time to the 21st century and do some things relating to the war with the Xindi here that's happening in Enterprise Season 3, but the entire episode takes place in 2004. Why is Carpenter Street set here with the rest of Enterprise instead of back in the 21st century section? So for this one, we have to apply a separate rule. So remember when I said that when an episode, the scene where an episode ends on, that's where it fits in the sequence. The same thing applies to multi-episode arcs. So for example, in Star Trek Voyager, we've got the episode pair Future Tense, where they travel back in time to 1996. I'm not going to find it, it's too long. They travel back in time to 1996 and hijinks ensue. That is a two-part episode. The first part of the episode ends in 1996, and then the second part of the episode ends back in the 24th century. If we take those two episodes as a single unit, a single narrative entity, then the whole thing begins and ends in the 24th century, and we can ignore the break in the middle. We have to extend that same rule to longer story arcs. So back in Enterprise, the entire third season is one long serialized arc. So it's one long storyline broken up into 24 different episodes, 24 chapters in one story. So we have to treat the whole block as being continuous. So that is not true of the original series Assignment Earth. Remember, original series episodes were meant to be standalone episodes, so it's not part of a greater narrative. So even though some of the characters in universe are perceiving time flowing in a particular way, that's not true of all the characters, and it's up to us to decide which should be the overriding metric there. And for me anyway, it's the in-universe date. But from the Star Trek Enterprise point of view, because this is one long narrative from beginning to end of Season 3 dealing with the Xindi crisis, Carpenter Street is just one episode in the middle of that sequence, and so we can't separate that from the rest of that cultural context. The same is true also of Star Trek Picard Season 2, where most of the season is set in 2024. They travel back in time to last year. But because it's all part of one serialized arc, the beginning and the end of the season both take place in 2401. Therefore, the entire arc is set in 2401. Not the most elegant solution to the problem, but it's the best thing I can do. All right, here's another funny one that's worth considering. The final episode of Star Trek Enterprise is called These Are the Voyages. So you'd expect it to be down here, except it's not. Here we've got the final episode listed as Terra Prime. So you might recall that there is a considerable time skip between Terra Prime and the final episode. These are the Voyages of, I think it's 7 years in universe time. And there we see the final voyage of the Enterprise in X-01 as they're heading back to Earth to sign the Charter of the United Federation of Planets. The story arc that begins in concludes Terra Prime ends there, and there is no story arc that continues from Terra Prime onto These Are the Voyages. These Are the Voyages is an entirely separate standalone episode, except that episode is bookended as being part of an episode of The Next Generation. So at the beginning and the end of These Are the Voyages, it starts with Commander Riker on the holodeck consulting a historical recreation, a holographic recreation of the events of that final mission of the Enterprise NX-01. And that consultation that Commander Riker has is actually set within another episode, an episode of The Next Generation called Pegasus. Let's find that episode here. Here. So the Pegasus is set in the year 2370, and These Are the Voyages, because it is a holographic recreation that takes place during the events of the Pegasus, is also set during that time. The beginning and the end of that episode both occur in 2370. So most of the events, most of the narrative that we see on screen is set many years earlier, 200 plus years earlier, back in the 22nd century. That is all bookended, it's all bracketed within the 24th century. But now the end of These Are the Voyages takes place before the end of Pegasus. So here we get to another rule that we have to live by here. If an episode is fully encapsulated by another episode, then the one that is encapsulated we must watch afterwards, because clearly from a narrative point of view we are expected to be watching the wider episode first and then the narrower episode second, so that our information from the first episode carries on to the narrower one. And that is how we express it here. There's another example of that happens back here in the final episode of Star Trek Prodigy. Ouroboros Part 1, again, has a couple of time skips in it. It's set in the year 2385, and there are several skips of a few weeks or months duration during the course of the episode. And the following episode, which is Short Trek's The Children of Mars, which is only set within a single day, within a single morning, the entirety of that morning is contained within Ouroboros Part 2. We see the events of Children of Mars taking place in the background in Ouroboros Part 2. So we watch Ouroboros Part 2 first and Children of Mars second. Beg your pardon. What about Those Old Scientists, you might ask? So what is Those Old Scientists? Those Old Scientists is an episode of Star Trek Strange New Worlds Season 2, in which a couple of characters from Star Trek Lower Decks travel back in time and meet up with the crew of the Enterprise, the Pike's Enterprise NCC 1701. And it's a really fun episode, one of my favorites. Where should that belong in the continuity? Well, if we follow the rules, it's quite simple. The very first and very last scenes of the episode, especially the very last scene of the episode, is in this proper context in the year 2259. So that is where we put it. We put it there. Even though some of the characters experiencing it are from the distant future, we're just going to have to catch up with those characters when we get around to them in the continuity. And then this brings us back to the Kelvin timeline. So there is there's a group online called the Star Trek Chronology Project who have undergone a similar process to what I've done here. They have taken it on their task to try and sequence the Star Trek canon in a coherent and manageable in-universe sequence. And although I think I and they follow very similar rules, we disagree when it comes to the Kelvin timeline. Let's go back to here to illustrate what I'm talking about here. What they think of from a Watsonian point of view is the point of view of Spock. So Spock is the one character that is common both to the Prime timeline and to the Kelvin timeline. So at this moment, the Romulan supernova, Spock is one of the characters who is hurtled back in time and meets up with this alternate timeline. So he doesn't go all the way back here to the temporal incursion with the Narada. He arrives in this alternate timeline several years later, where he meets up with his younger self and young Kirk and things like that. So they say that from his point of view, it makes sense to sequence the Kelvin timeline films after the Romulan supernova in the viewing sequence, which means watching these three films after Prodigy and after Children of Mars, but before we get to Picard. Now, before Star Trek Picard was released, I agreed with that position. That is no longer the case. Now that we have more content in the Prime timeline set after that incident, I think it no longer makes sense to fit it into that context, especially since we have a couple of very light instances of contact between the Prime timeline and the Kelvin timeline. We don't actually see any of those instances on screen, but they are referred to a handful of times in conversation in the later Discovery seasons. So we know that there has been, during the centuries, contact between both timelines. Here's an example of one of them. Time Soldier Yor travels from the Kelvin timeline through to the Prime timeline at some point in this time gap. So because they are not completely separate, there is contact in between them. We have to treat them as being one in the same timeline. And so I have decided to slip the Kelvin timeline content in the appropriate time for that episode. So for the 2009 feature film, it is set in stardate 2258.42, which, as we discussed, means that it is in the year 2258 in what's the fourth month? April? Yes, April. So it happens in April in 2258. Again, that's the last scene of the film. There are several time gaps in that film. It actually starts much earlier. So that's where we watch that. So even though we're looking at a different timeline, a different continuity, a different set of versions of familiar characters, that is the time in which it happens. So it's happening in a parallel timeline. Same thing comes when we get to Star Trek Into Darkness. We've just, a few months ago, we saw the end of Strange New Worlds Season 2, and Star Trek Into Darkness is set just a few weeks or months after that episode. So it's probably going to take place before Strange New Worlds continues, although it looked like the final episode of Season 2 was a two-parter, so we'll probably get part 2 of that first, then a time skip, and Into Darkness would fit into that time skip, and then it's likely to continue after that. And then there's a gap of a couple of years between. Oh, it's worth noting here that Star Trek Strange New World seasons 3 and 4 are on this list because they have been announced, but you'll notice here that they are unreleased because they haven't yet been released. We don't know the names of those episodes yet. We don't know when they're coming. So I've slotted them in here so that we can remember that they're coming, but they don't actually yet exist. There's going to be a time gap of a year or two between Strange New World Season 4 and Star Trek the original series, and Star Trek Beyond fits in somewhere in that gap as well. So we treat them as being contemporaneous, even though they are in alternate timelines. It's just the only way to make that work. But this is also worth noting that we are, as I mentioned, in a period where new canon is being created all the time. So we are aware that 2 new seasons of Strange New Worlds are on the horizon. We're going to be getting one this year sometime, and the next season, maybe even as soon as next year. But also currently in production is a new series called Star Trek Starfleet Academy, and this is one that's going to give me a headache. Nothing about the series itself necessarily. It's too soon to know whether or not it's going to be something that I'm going to... it's going to be one of my favorites or not. We just don't know yet. What's going to give me a headache is the final episode of Star Trek Discovery. So that episode also has a time skip in it. Now, it is the first 2 acts of the episode are part of the season 5 story arc. So it is one of those serialized narratives where the entire season is one long story broken up into chapters, and the first 2 acts of the final episode is the final chapter of that story arc. Then there is a time skip within the episode of, we don't actually know how long, but it seems to be around 30 years. And the 3rd act is actually linking Discovery up to the final episode here, Calypso, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. So these 2 are part of the same narrative arc, but this one is also part of that narrative arc. Now, when Star Trek Starfleet Academy arrives, we don't actually know when it's going to be set in the canon yet, but what we do know suggests that it's probably going to be set a year or 2 after the events of Season 5 of Discovery are set. So it's going to be probably in the year 3192. Problem is, the last few scenes, or the last act of Discovery, life itself, is set decades later. So now we're going to end up with a situation where an entire series sits within the gap of a single episode of another series, and I don't yet have a viable solution to that. As of now, this episode is continuous with this one because this series doesn't yet exist, but by the time we get around to this in the rotation again, that's going to have changed, and I'm hopefully going to have a viable solution to that problem. Hopefully by then, that is a couple of years away. Hopefully by then AI will be much smarter than me, and I'll be able to get AI to come up with a solution for that for me. But until then, I just don't know. All right, so that is how we revise the timeline as new stuff comes in. Oh, there's an important thing I should have mentioned about how we sequence these things. So again, as I said, there's a episode every day from the very beginning of canon to the very end. You'll notice that here we are, we're looking right at the end, and there's a color change here under the viewing date column. So all of these are green. These are all past dates. This yellow one, that is today. That is today's date, which means that this episode, Star Trek Discovery Season 5, Episode 8, Labyrinths, is today's episode. So we'll be watching that one today. We'll be watching Lagrange Point tomorrow. And then the very next episode is Life Itself, the final episode of Discovery. And then on Thursday will be, Friday will be Calypso, which is a short Treks episode, which is the very last episode, chronologically speaking. It is unambiguously the last episode. It is set roughly 1,000 years after the end of life itself, in the 43rd century. We don't have a date any more precise than that, but the word 1,000 years is spoken a couple of times in dialogue, so we know that that is fairly reliable. We don't actually have an unknown section here anymore. That's gone. We can empty this one too. Right, so that is the very final episode. So we're going to be watching that on Thursday this week. Is that right? Thursday, Friday? Later this week. And then we're going to jump all the way back to the beginning again, and we're going to start again with Assignment Earth. This was the last time that we watched Assignment Earth together, which was on the 5th of August 2022. I'm going to update this date and republish the entire sequence and send it to a Google Calendar, which is where the automated posting to the Future History channel happens from that Google Calendar. You're also welcome to view the Google Calendar if you go to the Dauntless website. If you go to our schedule page, here is a view of various Google Calendars that you can add as overlays to your own Google Calendars. And including in here is our daily devotional schedule, or my daily devotional schedule. So by add to calendar, you can just add this as an overlay to your personal calendar if you like. Or you can just follow along in the Future History channel here in the Dauntless Discord. But now what about conflicts when it comes to canon status? Okay, so you'll have noticed that in this column here, I've got most of them have green canon status. Some of them have red, indicating that they haven't yet been released, so unreleased stuff. But then I've also got some blue ones. What do the blue ones mean? So there are some issues with especially animated content where there are apparent contradictions between what we see in the animated content and what we see in the live action content. Thankfully, there are few, if any, obvious contradictions in the live action content, at least nothing that we can't explain away, but there are a few contradictions in animated stuff that are very difficult to explain. So what we can do here is we can borrow another term from Christian scholarship, and that is that we can consider them apocryphal. So the way that a number of Christian denominations resolve their conflict when it comes to deciding what is and is not canon is that some churches will agree that, okay, this set of books is canon, but then there's these other books that we also think are interesting and might belong in canon too, but we concede that not everybody agrees that those things are part of canon, or maybe there are things in there we don't completely agree with. So we'll publish them together in the same volume, but we'll give them a different label. We'll call them the Apocrypha. They are apocryphal. So things that can be considered more or less reliable, but are of questionable authenticity. So that's the designation that we've decided to use for the animated content. Now, this is a rule of mine, and a lot of other scholars use a similar rule, and I think it makes sense. What that helps us do is it helps us to resolve a number of conflicts that we see in the animated stuff. One of the conflicts that we see is, I've got memory alpha here. Let me search it up rather than trying to remember which episode it is. So we initially meet Robert April in the animated series from release point of view, and he looks like this. This is what Robert April looked like. Robert April is a Starfleet Commodore who was the original captain of the USS Enterprise before Captain Pike, and that's what he looked like. We then see him later, from our point of view anyway, in live action, and he looks like this. That's not the same guy. So it's clearly intended to be the same character, but he definitely looks very different. So how do we resolve this conflict? Well, if we consider that the animated version is apocryphal, we can chalk this up to artistic impression, or an artistic rendering of what the artist thinks happened on that day. So this is live action. This is the historical documents. This is what actually happened from Watsonian point of view, and the animated stuff is just somebody's rendering of what they think happened. And in this case, the artist had an inaccurate impression of what Commodore April actually looked like. And there are a number of issues like that. If we look at the Short Treks episode Ephraim and Dot, which covers a number of decades of in-universe time. Ephraim and Dot, if you haven't seen it, is an animated short, deals with Ephraim, who is a tardigrade, a space alien, that sets up a nest inside the engine room of the USS Enterprise and is chased off by Dot, which is an automated maintenance drone, years and years after each other and through many of the Enterprise's interesting adventures. And we see Ephraim returning to the engine room of the Enterprise over and over again. The problem with that episode, there are a few problems, is that apologies, seems to be having network issues, but I think we're back. Some of the problems is that the engine room of the Enterprise was not consistent during that period, and it received multiple refits, completely redesigning it. So the tardigrade's eggs would not have gone undiscovered for that period. Even though they were sitting there next to the warp core incubating for many, many years, they would have been spotted and eradicated long before. So not a viable thing. There are canon issues with that, but it's animated, so we can chalk it up to an artistic rendering of the events that actually happened. This also helps us to resolve some of the stylistic issues in Star Trek Lower Decks, especially in the first couple of especially in the first season. It becomes less and less of an issue as we progress through the series. But it was very jarring to many of us when we first started watching Lower Decks, in that there was a very physical slapstick element to the comedy of the series. So Star Trek and comedy mix well, that's not necessarily an issue, but because there was a very physical slapstick element to it, that was what was quite difficult for a lot of us to process. Because Star Trek just doesn't work like that. But if we assume that these are not the actual events that we're witnessing, this is an artistic impression of the events. So we can assume that the events are accurate, but the stylistic details of how they took place on screen are probably not all that reliable. We can come to an approximation of what happened. So it's an enjoyable and fun rendering of the information, but probably not how things actually went down. I just glanced at the chat. Colonel Eber says Protestant upbringing says that the apocryphal books are akin to fan fiction. Perhaps, yes. And what the apocryphal designation allows us to do is we can safely pay attention to those things, but disregard any of the conflicts that might arise as being a non-issue. We can treat the live action sources as being the principal reliable source, as being the canon source, and anything that conflicts with that from animation we can disregard. In fact, for the longest time, the animated series was regarded as non-canon. Gene Roddenberry specifically said when it was produced that this should not be considered canon, and it was only years after his death, in fact only sort of in the mid-2000s, that Paramount started treating the animated series as being a reliable canon source of information. And now that a lot of the elements that were introduced in the animated series have been confirmed and upheld in other live action Star Trek shows, now we can largely reliably treat it as being more or less accurate. But of course, except for those few stylistic problems. Goodness, we're already over an hour. Let me try and wrap this up quickly. All right. So okay, I'm gonna keep talking about this unless I put it away. So let me switch back to this. All right. So why is it important that we study Star Trek canon in this way? Because we are the representatives of the Star Trek brand in the world, and especially in Africa and the Middle East. And we want to make sure that we have as comprehensive and as deep an understanding and a familiarity with the Star Trek universe as possible. And the best way of doing that is by watching the original source materials. It is such a colossal body of work, 900 plus episodes, that you just can't do it all in one sitting. It's not reasonable. It's not practical. But if you break it up into manageable bite-sized chunks, one episode a day, you can make it work. Now, I know life gets in the way. You can't always get around to watching an episode every day, especially if you get to one of the series that's not your favorite. It can be quite a slog to get through it. But what I do when I fall behind in that way is that I will set aside time, perhaps every second day, to watch 2 or 3 episodes in a row, so that I'm able to keep up more or less consistent with the daily schedule. I also, the way that I engage with the material as well is I don't engage with every episode with equal level of attention and equal level of enthusiasm. Something like The Next Generation or the original series, I've watched each episode dozens of times at this point, so I can recite them almost by heart. So although I do think it's important to rewatch them, even if it's for the 20th time, because you might encounter additional details that are salient in the new readjusted historical context now that we've got these new episodes in the sequence and that kind of thing, it probably doesn't require my full attention every time. So what I will often do, especially with those that I've seen many times before, is that I will put them on a second screen while I'm busy doing something else on my first screen, whether it's playing games or catching up on admin or something like that, so that I still have that sort of passive viewing experience. It's still kind of washing over me, but I don't necessarily need to pay rigid attention to it all the time. The newer stuff, however, episodes that I've only seen 2 or 3 times, I try to make sure that I'm paying rigid attention to each one of those episodes, because there's bound to be details that I missed on the first couple of viewings. And especially given new historical context with new stuff that's been added to the canon, I might be seeing new things that I didn't see before. It's far more likely to happen with newer stuff than it is with the older stuff. And then whatever you do notice, whatever you think is interesting, whatever you find notable or fascinating, please bring it to our attention. Come into the Future History channel and discuss it with us. Find the post that relates to the episode that you just watched, hit reply or create a thread and start a discussion about it. I try to do that with every episode, just so that I'm forcing myself to pay slightly more attention, even if I'm watching it in the background, to what's going on. I'm drawing connections between other things that I recognize or noticed in other episodes, and I'm just jotting it down and sharing those thoughts with everybody. So if you've got something to contribute, please do. Or if you just like to read it, that's fine too. It's there for you to read. And what I gain each time I go through this is, every time I go through the entire canon, even though it takes 3-4 years now to get through the whole thing, is each time I gain a much deeper understanding of the canon as a whole. Watching everything in its proper historical context in that way helps me to put the pieces together in my mind in a way that makes a lot more sense. It also helps me to remember things that I'd forgotten that I'd learned earlier, and bring those things to the center of my attention, which I think is a valuable experience for anybody studying or immersing themselves in a particular body of work, especially one as large as Star Trek. Right, so let us look at questions and comments. Goodness, there have been a lot of messages, so I'm just going to jump all the way up to the top. Let's see. Okay. Commander Shamali says, no, it didn't. I'm not sure what that was referring to. Oh, Captain Pancurna says, the pink trouble. So in the animated series, there were some issues with the coloring. So all troubles were pink in the animated series. And we now know that that's not the case. So that was one of the issues that was resolved with the apocryphal designation. Anything else that I'm tagged in? There we go. Seems like a great system to organize them, even if it's not perfect. Yes, thank you, Colonel Hubert. So the system of rules that I've come up with, like I said, there is no definitive sequence for watching Star Trek. It can't be done. Even if you're looking at chronological sequence, there's just too many variables, too many outliers to come up with a system that applies easily in all cases. But if you have a set of rules that guide you, then you can come up with something that is at least internally consistent and coherent, except for now the final episode of Discovery, which is going to give me a headache for the next year or two until I figure out how to solve it. Commander Shamali says, apocrypha is a Greek word that means things we've hidden away. Yes, it does mean that. Yes, we like to hide away the problems. When we're studying Star Trek, the assumption is that it is an entirely coherent and cohesive real universe. We're suspending disbelief momentarily while we study it, and we pretend that it is our actual future. And so a real universe can't have contradictions. Universes don't work that way. So when we have problems that arise, and especially because they seem to arise around the animated content, we can just hide those away by the fact that they're not 100% official. They're like partly official. Commander Shimali says, in religious context, at least as far as my personal Jewish upbringing is concerned, it's meant to be something you read in private, not necessarily something that's inaccurate or wrong. I think that's fair to say. I suppose it depends on which canon you're talking about. Here, it's that it's not, again, not strictly speaking wrong or inaccurate. We can assume that it is accurate that Commodore Robert April visited the Enterprise in 22 69 or 70, whenever it is that that episode is set. Just the details are a little off, so he doesn't look quite like that. We now know that he looks a little bit different, or that we know that in Star Trek Lower Decks in the first episode, Boimler maybe was swallowed by a giant alien spider and spat out again, but it probably wasn't as dramatic as the version of it that we saw on screen, because he would have broken every bone in his body. But it might have looked something like that. We certainly see something similar in the first episode of Discovery Season 3, where Burnham is swallowed by a transworm and then regurgitated. It's not as slapstick, it's not as exaggerated, but it's something similar. Commander Quatsa says, Master Chief Quatsa says, did the YouTube stream just end? There was a glitch in the YouTube stream, but I'm not sure if it continued or not. It stopped at 1 hour 5 minutes. Okay, what I'll do then is I'll upload this video to YouTube so you can get the full version of it. That shouldn't be a problem. All right, in that case, I think that is everything that we needed to cover there. So I'm gonna conclude by saying that Star Trek is more than just a series. It's a philosophy, a framework for understanding the universe and our place in it. By engaging with it daily in a structured way, we not only deepen our knowledge, but also strengthen the shared values that unite us as a crew. Thank you all for your time and attention. That is all for today. You are dismissed. Swart out.
The Starfleet Life with the USS Dauntless. Are you brave enough to be a Starfleet officer? Do you have what it takes